Okay, let's pivot over to medicine, which to me is more accurately described as medical treatment. So I want to start with something that is a bit of a test of discernment, of careful reading, to show what I think is a strong indicator of the nature and character of the medical treatment system. So this is from the CDC's website, cdc.gov, and it's called 50 Years of Progress in Chronic Disease Epidemiology and Control. And this was written in 2011 by Patrick Remington, MD. So here we go. During the past century in the United States, advances in public health and healthcare have increased life expectancy by approximately 30 years. Impressive. And led to dramatic changes in the leading causes of death. Wow. As chronic diseases became the leading causes of illness and death in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, public health researchers began to shift their focus to identifying their complex and interrelated causes. In addition, researchers began to study ways to prevent and control chronic diseases through clinical and community-based interventions. Considerable progress has been made during the past 50 years in understanding the causes of chronic diseases, as well as in development of the evidence for effective strategies to prevent, detect, or control chronic diseases. So did you pick up on what I meant by careful reading? Seems to me that when you're talking about disease or any health condition for that matter, would a cure be of interest? Well, obviously not, because just the portion I read repeated their areas of focus twice, just to make sure the healthcare providers heard them. It said, considerable progress has been made during the past 50 years in understanding the causes of chronic diseases, as well as developing the evidence for the effective strategies to prevent and detect and control chronic disease. So if you're studying the causes of something and you're working to prevent, detect, and control it, that something needs to be around. And I can't leave the topic without poking the bear, because chances are you or someone you know has been diagnosed with cancer. So here it is. Do you believe they're really trying to cure it? Suppose, say, someone maybe, potentially, might have, a cure. Are we supposed to believe that the owners, shareholders, boards of directors, financial institutions that support them, employees, vendors, suppliers, construction companies that erect their monuments of ignorance, and, of course, the legislators who gladly accept the healthcare companies' campaign contributions will welcome that news? Really? Oh, wow. I hadn't seen that. My bad. And before we move on, let me give you a name I think you should be really interested in, and that is Royal Raymond Rife. So Rife had reported that a beam array device of his invention could destroy microbial pathogens, and I've included some video here to show what that looked like. And he was actually capturing this on microscopes that he had built himself. And as another aside and thread to tug at, it's alleged that his microscopes were actually what was taken and used to create the electron microscope, and that his microscopes came well before that, which they did, by the way. And it's proven that his microscopes could catch and basically film things live and moving, almost like video, whereas the electron microscope was always a still image. He also claimed to have documented what he calls a mortal oscillatory rate for various pathogenic organisms, and to be able to destroy those organisms by vibrating them using radio waves of this particular frequency. According to the San Diego Evening Tribune in 1938, Rife stopped short of claiming that he could cure cancer, but did argue that he could devitalize disease organisms in living tissue with certain exceptions. An obituary in the Daily Californian described his death at the age of 83 in 1971, stating he died penniless and embittered by the failure of his device to garner scientific acceptance. He blamed the scientific rejection of his claims on a conspiracy involving the American Medical Association, impossible, and the Department of Public Health and other elements of, quote, organized medicine, which had, quote, brainwashed and intimidated his colleagues. Now let's go to another underlying causal factor that is probably a little more widely known than the Codex Alimentarius scheme, but I don't think much more, and that is the Flexner Report. And I'd argue that this occupies another spot high on the list among the causal factors contributing to the sick care construct we have today. They say video is worth 60 bits per second, so here is one of the best breakdowns I've seen, and it comes with some really informative context. This is from James Corbett's How Big Oil Conquered the World.
Pharmaceuticals provided a lucrative new opportunity for the oligarchs. But in a turn-of-the-century America that was still largely based on naturopathic, herbal remedies, it was a tough sell. The oligarchy went to work changing that. In 1901, John Dee established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. The institute recruited Simon Flexner, a pathology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, to serve as its director. His brother, Abraham, was an educator who was contracted by the Carnegie Foundation to write a report on the state of the American medical education system. His study, the Flexner Report, along with the hundreds of millions of dollars that the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations were to shower on medical research in the coming years, resulted in a sweeping overhaul of the American medical system. Naturopathic and homeopathic medicine, medical care focused on unpatentable, unmarketable natural remedies and cures, was now dismissed as quackery. Only drug-based allopathic medicine requiring expensive medical procedures and lengthy hospital stays was to be taken seriously.
And what about the role of those vaunted, oft-quoted medical journals and the seemingly irreproachable world of the peer review process? I found this article at the Alliance for Human Research Protection's website, and before I share some portions of it, this piece was written by Marcia Engel, and I think it's important for you to hear some of her background. She is an American physician, author, and the first woman to serve as the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. She is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School in Boston. She is a frequent contributor to both medical journals and the popular media on a wide range of topics, particularly medical ethics, health policy, the nature of medical evidence, the interface of medicine and the law, and end-of-life healthcare. So this specific piece I'm talking about is titled Medical Journals Complicit in Corruption of Medicine, and here are a few excerpts. In 2002, I made a presentation about conflicts of interest at a symposium sponsored by the U.S. Army Medical Department, in which I included my Dirty Dozen, corrupt research review practices that undermine both the safety of human subjects and the integrity of the research findings. Now, just as another aside, I do many of these, but Dirty Dozen, that's an interesting term that's used there. And then in 2001, we get the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which I'm sure is pure as the driven snow, and they published a list of the Disinformation Dozen. So these are people in the healthcare field, writers, etc., a lot of these are doctors, who they say were forwarding the greatest amount of disinformation and were responsible, just these 12 of them, for the majority of disinformation and the lack of vaccination that was going on. So you might want to factor that one in. The article goes on, a growing number of prominent physician scientists, including several former journal editors and New York Times columnists, have written sobering critiques about the corrupting impact pharmaceutical industry influence has on medicine. That influence has debased the integrity of medical research, clinical practice, and medicine's institutions. Strong words. Continues, those most responsible for the corruption of medicine are medicine's academic leaders, prestigious medical institutions, journal editors, experts charged with formulating practice guidelines, and federal oversight agencies, in particular the FDA, the National Institutes of Health, and the Center for Disease Control. And it cites a gentleman, Richard Smith, MD, the former editor of the British Medical Journal, that's BMJ, we'll come to that one in just a second, has been an outspoken critic focusing in particular on the role journal editors have played in the corruption of medicine. His book, The Trouble with Medical Journals in 2004, describes journal editors' unacknowledged, significant conflicts of interest. And then readers of the New York Times got a dose of reality in 2006 when Lawrence Altman, MD, the paper's senior medical reporter, wrote a scathing appraisal of science journal editors' poor performance in maintaining scientific integrity. Altman lifted the veil of illusion to reveal that the scientific fraternity, interesting term, has vested financial and political interests in maintaining an illusion that, quote, passing peer review is the scientific equivalent of the good housekeeping seal of approval, end quote. Journal editors recoil at suggesting that the review process for scientific reports itself be tested in accordance with scientific methods. They reject conducting random audits like those used to monitor quality control in medicine, citing costs and the potential for creating distrust. Wow. And it has this quote, "The economic logic of the medical industrial complex is straightforward. Prescription drugs and high-technology medical devices account for a growing share of medical spending. Both are products that are expensive to develop, but relatively cheap to make. So the profit from each additional unit sold is large, giving their makers a strong incentive to do whatever it takes to persuade doctors and hospitals to choose their products." And then this is really the big one. This is, again, Dr. Engel, who I mentioned at the beginning. She says, "It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine." Boom. And on the topic of chronic diseases we pour billions into studying, preventing, and treating, but not curing, I discovered this book, and listen to this description. The book is titled Chronic Disease in the 20th Century, A History, and it's written by George Weisz. Chronic disease in the 20th century challenges the conventional wisdom that the concept of chronic disease emerged because medicine's ability to cure infectious disease led to changing patterns of disease. Instead, it suggests, the concept was constructed and has evolved to serve a variety of political and social purposes. And I'll acknowledge that this next one is a bit personal, especially given my distaste for authority and its symbols. But what is it about a white coat with a person's name and some letters stitched on it that seems to magically propel them to the status of a god?
The question is, do I have a god complex? Which makes me wonder if this lawyer has any idea as to the kind of grades one has to receive in college to be accepted at a top medical school. If you have the vaguest clue as to how talented someone has to be to lead a surgical team. I have an MD from Harvard. I am board certified in cardiothoracic medicine and trauma surgery. I have been awarded citations from 7 different medical boards in New England, and I am never, ever sick at sea. So I ask you, when someone goes into that chapel and they fall on their knees and they pray to God that their wife doesn't miscarry, or that their daughter doesn't bleed to death, or that their mother doesn't suffer acute neural trauma from post-operative shock, who do you think they're praying to? Now, you go ahead and read your Bible, Dennis, and you go to your church, and with any luck you might win the annual raffle. But if you're looking for God, he was in operating room number 2 on November 17th, and he doesn't like to be second-guessed. You ask me if I have a God complex? Let me tell you something. I am God.
Oh, well, I guess that explains it. And hey, if Alec Baldwin says it, you know it's verified.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them, never.
But back to medical apparel, I found this article. It's called The White Coat, Symbol of Professionalism or Hierarchical Elitism. Ooh. And that was just too sassy for me to pass up, so here are some portions of it. With the possible exception of a priest's clerical collar, there is no workplace clothing as threaded, good one, with symbolism as a doctor's white coat. Trained surgeons, soon followed by physicians, began wearing white lab coats in the late 1800s to distinguish themselves from the quacks and snake oil healers who did not practice evidence-based medicine. These days, depending on who you ask, the white coat might stand for professionalism, integrity, and the highest commitment to caring for the sick and suffering. Or it might represent elitism and the reckless spreading of germs. Whoa. With all of this territory covered, I've talked about causes, and I've been careful to note that there are many of them. But the undeniable cause of the dumpster fire that's called food and nutrition and medicine and health in this country is what it's always been. It's masses of people being conned into giving up ever-increasing amounts of their sovereignty in exchange for comfort and perceived security. And that's the very natural consequence of spending so much time and paying so much attention to how we can most efficiently get someone else to do pretty much everything for us, including our thinking. But the good news is that because we caused it, we can also fix it. And that can only be done through the transition of the ego-driven, uber-propagandized creatures we've become to awakened and enlightened beings who are in harmony with natural law and undertake the ascension of consciousness as their ethos. If true, could a practical application of that message be that withdrawing our participation from the corrupted portions of our sick care construct be the best and first step? So going back to the C word, if you were diagnosed with cancer, would you automatically rush headlong into surgery, get your chemotherapy and radiation scheduled, and gulp down the highly questionable priest-scientist pharmaceuticals? Or, even in the face of the ridicule you would most certainly face, could you allow for the possibility that there's another path? All right, let's close this out with some words from Thomas Edison. He said, "The doctor of the future will no longer treat the human frame with drugs, but rather will cure and prevent disease with nutrition." Well, thanks for joining me, and you'll want to come back next time for a conversation on the illusion of time, our 10th technique of mind control. And remember to always do your own thinking. Until then, be well.